All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about critical mineral supply chains. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. For those who are joining us for the first time, I'd like to just make a quick introduction to who we are. We are an inclusive international nonprofit, and we're bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. What we're really trying to do is we're striving to make really important global affairs topics that are shaping our world accessible and contextualized. And we really want to give depth to topics that really can't be reduced to a 2-minute news piece. And today's topic is a really fascinating one, and judging by the number of people who are joining, there really is a strong interest in getting more information about the shape of the critical mineral supply chains. So just as a little background, in June 2021, the Biden administration released a report on resilient supply chains that included assessments of everything from large capacity batteries to pharmaceuticals, semiconductors to critical minerals. So all of these areas are critical to national security, economic security, and also technological leadership for all nations. Today, we're going to focus on critical minerals, which are really the building blocks of products that we use every day, from airplanes and engines to defense equipment. They include lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and others. And demand for these metals is really expected to surge over the next 2 decades in conjunction with net zero carbon goals. So by some estimations, it could be anywhere from 2,500 to 4,000% increase in demand in the next couple of decades. So quite a bit of demand reshaping this economy. And against this backdrop are the geopolitical tensions between China and the US, with China estimated to control 55% of global rare earths mining capacity, with rare earths being a subset of the critical mineral family. So what can we expect from the critical mineral supply chain of the future, given this geopolitical posturing that is taking place? How can the world address climate goals when the solutions may create new problems in the form of heightened geopolitical rivalry or unanticipated consequences? And how can the United States look inward and not just outward for these solutions? So I am very pleased today to be joined by Morgan Bazilian and Sharon Burke. Morgan is the director of the Payne Institute and a professor of public policy at the Colorado School of Mines. And previously, he was a lead energy specialist at the World Bank and has over 2 decades of experience in the energy sector. And then we have the Honorable Sharon Burke, and she is the founder and president of Ecospherics and has served in Congress, the State Department, and the Pentagon, most recently as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. And regrettably, the wonderful Zoe Liu will no longer be able to join us today. For those who saw her speak in person last week, you know what a treat it is to hear her share her expertise. But fortunately, we're in very good hands with Morgan and Sharon. So with that, Morgan, I'm going to start with you, with where I like to usually start with a bit of a scene setter. Could you please describe what the current critical mineral supply chains look like? Who are the players that are involved and at what stages? And why have they become such a pivotal and strategic concern for both economic security, economic development, and national security?
Thank you very much, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be with you. Honored to be on a Network 2020 with my friend, the Honorable Sharon Burke, who is marvelous on this topic. I think your introduction covered the wider scale of the issue of critical minerals. Why are we talking about these things? How did the vocabulary become part of a wider public discussion? Is an interesting one. In the United States, my belief is that critical minerals have risen up the priority list primarily for political reasons and primarily because of the ongoing trade war with China. And it also happens to be, and we can go into this, one of the only topics that is roughly bipartisan. In other words, both parties are interested in critical minerals, partially for different reasons, but at least to an extent, both because of the so-called domination of China in this space. Now, so what are these things? There are confusingly quite a few different lists of what a critical mineral is. The United States is not alone in having a critical minerals list. The European Union has one, Japan has one, Australia has one, Canada has one, and many and other countries and regions as well. And the methodologies to describe the term criticality varies dramatically across those different regions. So as an example, in the United States, we think of this in terms of supply side security, so to speak. And in other words, how much are we importing of these materials and chemicals versus and from where countries like Canada and Australia take an almost inverse approach. In other words, they're thinking about how these minerals contribute to their own economic development through trade. So that's the first thing to say. Now, to make this landscape a little bit more complex, the United States does have technically one critical minerals list put out by the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. That's been going on for years. We had critical minerals lists going back to 1973 and before, so it's not a new topic. But now, recently, the Department of Energy just released its own critical minerals list, which is in fact different than the USGS and uses a different methodology and has different but overlapping minerals. So even for someone who watches this space fairly closely, like I do and Sharon does, that is in fact a bit confusing. So we have these lists of what is critical. I've said that I believe that in the United States, it's high on the agenda because of politics. We're also looking at significant demand increases for some of these minerals from energy transitions, and that is primarily because of electric vehicle growth and the batteries in the electric vehicles, but it's not only that. These minerals are also used in solar panels, in wind turbine motors, etc. And so as you look forward, you can see demand growing rapidly for the energy aspects of these. So each of these minerals already exists, has markets. The energy part of those market demand is growing rapidly. The criticality list is not limited to energy. At least the USGS list is not limited to energy uses. It also includes those for national security, defense, military uses. And so there's another word called military metals, which has a different connotation, as you might imagine. And maybe I'll stop with the opening by just saying that China does in fact dominate this space. When we think of these minerals, it's often discussed in terms of the actual mineral or element themselves, which is a myopic way to look at this discussion. Really, it's much more useful to look across supply chains from the minerals through their refined products, which tend to be chemicals, into advanced manufacturing, into things like electric vehicles or batteries or cell phones or myriad other consumer products. And China has been working on this for decades. And so it's not a new area to them. And the reason they dominate the market is sort of complex, but at least one of them is because they realized this was going to be an important part of modern economies and modern societies decades ago. And that the other question on China then tends to be, well, is America going to catch up, or can America dominate? It's sort of the wrong question. The answer to that question is, well, probably not. And because China is not just standing still as America takes note of this area. And so they're actively investing and working on this all over the world. So hopefully I gave you, Courtney, a little bit of a paintbrush look at critical minerals, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Sharon, turning to you, how can the U.S. strengthen its supply chain, and what are the implications of doing so outside of traditional national security? So if you're trying to make the argument of why we need to do this, I think, I mean, you can certainly go into the national security implications, because I think that's important, but I think it would also be interesting to see how environmental and sustainability concerns factor in, and whether or not, if I'm gonna do a multi-part question, does the need for environmental stewardship put the United States at a disadvantage in this regard when it comes to playing or trying to play catch up? Maybe we can't totally play catch up.
Okay, so now I gotta let me unpack the question a little bit, and Courtney, just jump in if you want to remind me of the full trajectory there. Minerals, it's funny because the importance of minerals to economies is nothing new. Of course, they've always been, we had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age for a reason. That these have always been, important materials that economies are based on, going way, way back. So in a way, it's nothing new at all. What's different now is that the current global economy, sort of the information age or the digital age economy, relies on a suite of materials. Some are very traditional, like copper, which, as Morgan, who is the real expert on this, as Morgan mentioned, that new U.S. Department of Energy list, copper is on that list, which it hasn't been on the criticality list before. And friends at USGS have told me it's not because copper is not critical, and it really worried them that it wasn't on the list, actually, because it will be. And the scale of demand over time is going to make it critical, but it isn't right now necessarily. So the digital age economy, it's everything is depending not just on these more traditional materials such as copper or aluminum, but also on a suite of new materials where the demand for them is fairly recent, at least at this scale. So gallium, germanium, cobalt, lithium. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the things we haven't mentioned yet is that the IT sector depends on a lot of these materials. So if you ever wondered how your tablet screen is reactive, or the way that your little cell phone can have a battery that lasts so long, this is because you've got a periodic table in these devices. And while the amount per device is not very much, the performance, everything depends on a sustainable, lasting access to these materials. So that kind of demand has skyrocketed in the last 20 years because of IT, and for other reasons. I mean, there are also major infrastructure, and medical devices also depend on these materials. Some of them are, for example, not corrosive and not reactive, meaning that if it doesn't, your skin won't have an allergic reaction to it. So the fact that we have all these medical miracles where you can implant, new joints in your body, things like that, a lot of these materials are a really important part of that story. So there's a whole suite of amazing inventions that depend on access to these materials, plus all the things that Morgan talked about with renewable energy. And then in a more narrow sense of national security, defense equipment, modern defense equipment really depends on the same cross section. Everything from metals and things like titanium, which is under pressure right now because of Russia's war on Ukraine, to more boutique rare earth elements and things like that, or other materials that are important for things like glass coatings on lasers, things like that. So it's national security in the sense that, global prosperity depends on these materials. And that's increasingly true with the modern economy. But it's also national security in that modern defense technologies specifically rely on a lot of the same materials. So, as Morgan mentioned, China's had a lot of foresight in this area, particularly on they're not boutique anymore, but these critical minerals where there may not have been a huge demand in the past and there is now. And so China not only has developed its own industry, but also has developed the processing, because these materials, of course, don't come out of the ground in a usable state. They have to be highly processed. You have to actually get them out of the rock. Sometimes that, it depends on the purity of the ore, but sometimes that can be a real job. So you have to process them, which is, by the way, generally speaking, a very polluting process. So getting minerals out of the ground is polluting or destructive. Processing them is polluting and destructive. And then China has invested in both of those things at home, but also around the world, and has made agreements around the world to both produce and process, to mine and process these materials. And again, they were ahead of, they had foresight. You can't blame them for having foresight for where the global economy was going to go. That does mean that they have a very strong comparative advantage in a number of places. So should the United States, I think in general terms, the United States has been prizing, the US economy has been prizing, this is like not exactly a news flash. This everyone's been talking about this for some time now. Efficiency over resilience. And it's been very clear, certainly the pandemic brought this home, that wasn't necessarily a good idea. And we're paying the price for that now. So that is certainly true when it comes to minerals, is that China's been producing them, mining them and producing them more cheaply. And that has, been to the benefit of manufacturers around the world. However, now that we see that also means a very brittle supply chain, particularly when you're at odds with another country, okay, now we have a problem. So how can the United States fix that? Well, first of all, we do have some of these materials at home in the United States. We don't necessarily produce them as well as we could. There are a lot of reasons for that, including that the costs are higher here. Sometimes that's just a geological fact of life, that it's harder to get that material out. Sometimes it's because we have higher environmental standards than the Chinese do. Also land may be more expensive here. Labor may be more expensive here. There's a whole suite of reasons. Also, sometimes our permitting process, certainly on public lands, most minerals in this country are mined on private land. So there's a lot of discussion about fixing permitting and all that on public lands, but, and there's a lot of potential there for additional recovery, but most mining is actually on private land. So, but our process for approving mining and approving refining or processing is not easy, and that certainly has constituted a barrier. So that's one thing we could do and also we don't always know, there are two things we don't know enough about. One is where everything is, and so getting a better sense of where deposits are, commercially recoverable deposits. And the Inflation Reduction Act had a whole appropriation just to improve the U.S. Geological Survey's ability to scan for what's out there, which is huge. It's hard for them to get that kind of money sometimes in appropriations. So getting it is a big deal, being able to improve the mapping. And then secondarily, the other information piece that we lack on is knowing our own demand curves. So as Morgan talked about, with renewable energy, the demand curves for certain materials are really going to increase, like cobalt, for example, or lithium. So having a better sense of what that demand growth looks like will allow us to manage better. The other thing is the United States, I think there's a lot of tension right now politically, certainly on Capitol Hill in the US, between people who really want to focus on increasing production at home and investing in production worldwide. And there's no question we need to do both. Why it's being brokered as a zero-sum game is ridiculous. We have to do both for all kinds of reasons, including just, geological facts underground. So that there are some countries that have materials that you cannot recover in the United States. But also, I mean, just strategically speaking, it is not in our interests to walk away from the world and come home and, think that we can produce everything alone. We can't, and we shouldn't try. So to me, that is just an artificial argument that we have to have one or the other. And I don't understand. The other thing is that we don't want to race to the bottom on this. What the United States and our partners, our trade partners, have to offer is that we need to be clear that this is going to be a win-win proposition, that communities and countries that engage with us in improving the supply chain for these materials are going to be able to do it on their own terms too, that they benefit, that this is not something that's going to be done to others, that's not going to be extractive in the sense of social capital, not just from the materials. So we need to be very clear on that we are going to have environmental protections, we are going to engage with communities and respect community rights, and we are going to make sure that the communities and countries that work together on this also, keep some of the supply chain at home, develop their own economies, that this becomes a win-win proposition. Right now, I think the Chinese tend to be an extractives investor. So, that is something that we have to show as a competitive advantage for the United States, but we have to be very clear on that for ourselves and what that looks like. And I do think that means also we need to do some more investing in innovation. This industry has not necessarily been cutting edge. I did talk to a gentleman in one of the mining companies once who sort of bridled at that and said, we put company money into R&D. Fair. I'm glad they do, but in general, this industry has not been super cutting edge. Again, really ironic given that what they do for a living, they cut. But and obviously now we don't want to substitute one super polluting energy industry for a new super polluting energy industry that just pollutes differently. So we need to figure out how to do this better with a less destructive footprint. And then the last thing I would say, which is about, which is a lot, is I think one thing we also have to be careful not to take off the table is demand and use, that we can't solve all of these challenges just on the supply side. Even if we were to really improve technique and we were to really invest in recycling so that we get more of a circular economy, we're still not going to be able to meet demand for these materials if we continue to need as much as we do. So we also have to figure out how to need less. So that's an end use question, and it's a societal question about the way that we live that's very consumptive. It's about innovation, all of those things. So we can't take demand off the table too and say that everything can be exactly as it is if we just substitute, cobalt for oil. I think that would be a mistake to tell ourselves that that's the truth.
Thank you. You hit a lot of really great points in my wide-ranging question. So Morgan, I think we're going to jump off a little bit here and maybe address some of what Sharon just spoke about, but I'd like to hear your opinion because you did write an article earlier this year about your thoughts on the Biden administration's recent push towards securing Made in America for critical mineral supply chain. So could you expand on that approach, whether or not you think that approach is a good step towards self-reliance, and how would you suggest that the administration handle this issue?
Thanks, Courtney. So as usual, I agree entirely with Sharon, and just to pick up that sort of her last point to expand on, Sharon and I have also both worked quite a bit in the energy sector and energy security, and for many years, for decades, the notion in the energy sector of energy independence has been very politically attractive. So we have had the current energy secretary and president both use the term energy independence as a goal. We saw the last administration use that language. We saw the administration before that use the language, etc. So it's oddly, it's sort of a bipartisan piece of vocabulary because it's so politically attractive, or perceived to be politically attractive to voters. That is the idea that America can do everything on its own. And we see that manifest in different ways, whether it's physical walls or figurative walls, or in other words, on export controls or import controls and taxation, et cetera. It's always been a somewhat ridiculous idea, though. And so while it's politically attractive, it's rather nonsense as an actual goal. And that is also true in critical minerals. And so Sharon is exactly right in saying we need to think about this both from how the United States starts to reinvigorate its own mining and processing of minerals and chemicals, as well as work to strengthen the resilience of existing supply chains, that is still working with China, and diversify those supply chains, that is working with allies. And so going about it in any other way is not only suboptimal from an economic perspective, it's suboptimal from a security and resilience perspective. So, one of the first organizations that understood that very clearly was actually the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense, who knows how to fight wars and the horrible outcomes of wars, knows that you have to work with allies, and that is no different in how we should think about critical minerals supply chains. And so even the definition of criticality in the United States is almost solely, as I started by saying, and Sharon added this demand piece, the definition is only really looking at the supply side. It's how much we need, how much we import, and where we import it from. So that's the actual algorithm. But like taking cues from the energy space, we now have much more sophisticated ways to think about energy security, and some of those need to be applied here. That is, that security, or in this case, the term criticality, which can be used interchangeably in some ways, needs to consider not only demand, which Sharon said very eloquently, but also markets, institutions, and other parts of supply chains. And that's how we think of energy security now. Largely, the landscape has changed dramatically on energy security. It's now changing dramatically on critical minerals. And so if you put blinders on just on the supply side, you miss almost everything. And so do we need to reinvigorate and do more mining in the United States of these critical minerals? Yes, we do. But that alone is insufficient to create robust supply chains. And for various reasons, places like China, or specifically China, happen to be excellent at building infrastructure and building things like chemical refining plants. And that leads to another reason why we should not try to be an island. I was at a meeting the other day, and someone actually said, it was under the Chatham House rules, so I'm just saying what they said, not who, but they said, well, no country is an island. Of course, that's totally inaccurate. Ireland and Australia are both islands, as is New Zealand. But the point being that we're in a deeply interconnected space, and whether your colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations think of it as regional globalization or bigger globalization, in either case, we're deeply interconnected with other markets, and the more of that happens, in some cases, the better for pricing, etc. One of the reasons why it's so difficult in the United States to sort of go at this alone is something that's not often talked about, which is the workforce, the actual people who know how to do these things. So I am a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, which has the finest mining engineering department in the world, or one of them. And I think some of the people who actually are in that department are on this call, and they're the real experts in these minerals. But after World War II, we largely ceded that expertise, especially in minerals refining, chemical refining, to China because of both economics and environment. So in other words, it's environmentally very difficult. So the social license to actually put these things up in the United States is difficult. China does not have that issue to the extent we do. And economically, it wasn't viable. Now it is viable, but we've lost those 70 years of workforce development. China has lots of schools and universities training people in these areas. Actually, Chile is another place that does, and we do not. The attractiveness of the industry and grappling with its history, as well as the ability of students to make likely more money going into things like data science and similar, you can see directly even at the Colorado School of Mines, where we have one of our largest majors is in applied math, statistics, data science, machine learning, AI, quantum engineering, etc. The same as any STEM university in the United States. So I think working with allies is very important. Now, we've run into a couple issues with what working with allies means, not from the DoD perspective necessarily, but from the federal perspective. If we limit who we work with to those countries where we currently have free trade agreements, we are going to miss out on some very important places. And we've already seen that with Indonesia, with Tanzania, and others for some of these critical minerals, say in the two examples I gave on nickel. So we need to use enhanced diplomatic measures to ensure that those partnerships and allies work better. The State Department is doing that. There's something called a Mineral Security Partnership. There's even something called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative that was started under the last administration and survived, to do just that, to work with countries on a diplomatic efforts on critical minerals. But let's remember that Network 2020 knows this very well, as do most of the people on this call, I imagine. But diplomacy is a long-term play, and diplomacy does not fund infrastructure in the short term. And so it's subtle and it takes time, and it does not typically relieve these sort of things in the very short term. So you have to do all of these things at once, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start weaving in some questions from the Q&A box, even though I have more questions myself, but we're getting a lot of good ones from the Q&A box. And so I'd like to just kind of jump off on this point about cooperation with allies, because we have one questioner who's asking about whether we should be cooperating in developing strategies with allies like Australia and Canada that also have strong mining sectors. So Sharon, just turning to you on that, what's your take on what the current relationship is with ally countries like Australia and Canada, and how does that fit into this overall picture? Are there pieces that are missing? Are there strengths to those relationships? How do you see that evolving and working in this sphere?
That's clearly a cornerstone of the Biden administration's approach here, is to work especially with allies and partners, but not just restricted to that. So The Canada and Australia are two of the more important mineral producers in the world, and they happen to be also very important U.S. allies, formal treated allies. So there's a lot of a lot of coordination going on there. And what's really interesting about the way that they're approaching this is that it is both bipartisan and multilateral. So we're working very closely with these countries one-on-one to develop the partnership on minerals production, and also, as Morgan mentioned, in the minerals security partnership, where we're coordinating not just in a bilateral way on minerals that we both produce, but also to approach other countries. So we may not be doing well with Tanzania, as Morgan mentioned, but Australia just inked a big deal with them on mineral production, and we're working very closely with the Australians. So I think this is a really smart approach, to have a sort of a lattice work almost of both bilateral and multilateral partnerships and instruments that are aimed at making sure that we are cooperating with the major producers, but also cooperating with the major consumers. I think, and I think you're also seeing some interesting language coming out of Washington, D.C. right now about decoupling versus de-risking the relationship with China. China is going to remain a major producer of these materials, and China's made no secret of the fact that their long-term goal is to really develop their domestic market. And there were early white papers coming out of the Chinese ministries about not exporting minerals at all, and they've been using. I'm sure we're going to come to this, but they've been experimenting with that policy, shall we say? But in the meantime, they also depend on a global market, both for supply and for selling, for demand. So, when you hear words like de-risk, not decouple, I think that's actually positive, because I think all producers and consumers of these materials, given the scale of the challenge that we have because of climate change and biodiversity loss and all of those interlinking crises, we do need to collaborate. So, it requires global collaboration. There's good signs that that's happening. The Biden administration's approach as strong bilateral partners, especially with producer countries like Australia and Canada, but also these multilateral instruments, and then also leaving the door open for collaboration with China at the same time that we're trying to diversify away from reliance.
Thank you. And flipping to the other side of that coin, Morgan, I'll turn to you. We have a question here about what would the potential implications for Ukraine's rare earth metals and lithium reserves and its supply of 50% of the world's neon gas used in chip production and 40% of the world's krypton used in semiconductor production be if Russia succeeds in its war?
I don't know. I think what we saw, we can take some clues from what's been happening in food security for what might happen in critical mineral security. I think what we saw with food security, of course, was that with rising prices and the collapse of the Black Sea grain initiative, initially we saw very high prices, and the people that suffered the most were, as usual, people in developing and emerging economies. The prices have softened a little bit since, because new storage and new supplies have been made available, and so to a certain extent the market has moved into to heal itself a little bit, but there's still an acute food security crisis. On the mineral side, the impacts we saw initially were mostly on steel and nickel, and that came from various sanctions on steel and nickel, and we saw some significant impacts in the nickel market especially, although we can't attribute all of them to the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. and that brings us to some sort of interesting market questions, which I'll come back to. The neon question is especially troubling with the steel plant. There's also questions about the others that that you got that in the chat. The neon one though is disturbing because that was a major distributor of that, and we haven't talked much about advanced computer chips, of course, which are an even higher priority, a much higher priority, I would say, from both a military and civilian perspective than our renewable battery minerals or renewable energy things. They have a higher political agenda. So neon is a tough one. You know, on the other pieces, you know, I think what's important to look at is how markets respond to these things and how diversity of supply and diversity of demand can help, just like going back to that security question. And if we look at the markets, especially for some of these things, one thing that's really important in the critical mineral space is that they're not a homogeneous group. And so using analogies like oil markets or even gas markets, which are more regional, becoming more global, like oil, the analogy only works to a certain extent. And what we see is that the markets for many of these minerals, especially the smaller, or as Sharon has sort of elegantly named them, boutique ones, are that they're very frail markets. We saw the nickel market actually stop trading for a number of weeks on the London Metal Exchange shortly after the war, while the impacts of nickel coming from Russia were maybe played some role in it. It really was about short selling and the sort of inherent frailty of these markets. They're not transparent mostly. They're not well governed mostly. They are being priced in different kinds of different currencies, and even that price discovery is very poor over time, and their scale is minute compared to, say, the scale of the global oil market, which would dwarf all of them. And so what we have is, whenever we have some kind of network problem along the supply chain in critical minerals, we're not getting the right kind of signals from the market. And that is, in my mind, one of the largest risks to the stability of supply chains in critical minerals. The last thing I would say about the war in Ukraine is, of course, the commodities prices for most of these things was very high before the war. We tend to forget that in the United States, because the United States was largely, well, one, because we tend to be rather parochial, and two, because we were largely spared the price increases of this ongoing global energy crisis. And so we didn't feel it politically as much. And so something to consider is, in any conflict, if we did some sort of network analysis of those supply chains, markets are, in my view, one of the places we should be looking most carefully at.
And I just wanted to add, I think that's really important. And as Morgan said, with the grain exports from both Russia and Ukraine, we got a really scary object lesson in that. We're still getting it, just that it's not just those two countries that bear the brunt, but the entire world grain market, and particularly some of the importers in the Middle East and North Africa, and including some that really cannot afford to see prices go up and to see disruptions. So that sort of network analysis, I think, is really important. The other thing I would just add about Ukraine is that, you know, countries go to war for a lot of reasons, and there's rarely one single driver. There may be one single catalyst, but there's rarely one driver. And I think you could certainly argue that Russia sees Ukraine as or at least they claim to see it as part of their Russian identity, and that was one of the drivers. But if you look at where their initial military salients were, they're highly correlated, where a lot of this industrial activity and the mining activity is. So it is not lost on Vladimir Putin that Ukraine is already a producer of many of these materials and could certainly be producing a lot more. So it's no accident.
Thank you. And this is a related question, actually, and I'll stick with you on this, Sharon. And of course, Morgan, feel free to jump in. So this questioner asks, given that the biggest risk is China cutting off supply in retaliation for something like our tech restrictions. So basically looking at the China piece. And the questioner asks if China builds a mine in another country, could they control exports to the US? And if so, what could we do about it? So is that another level of risk that we should be thinking about?
Well, I mean, the United States and China are in the middle of, you can call it whatever you want to. A lot in the media is saying it's a trade war. You could call it a trade correction, whatever. There's definitely a battle going on here over trade, and minerals are part of it. So the Trump administration levied some pretty high tariffs on China. The Biden administration has not rolled most of those back. China just, I think, over the summer announced that it was restricting exports of germanium and gallium, which are, as Morgan pointed out, those are really important for semiconductors. And now you're talking, critical business, not just critical minerals. So this back and forth has been going on, and it's not like China invented that. The United States also has a long history of using sanctions and economic tools or weapons of statecraft to influence global market and global partners to comply with our values or our policies. So it's not like this is unprecedented for either country, but China definitely has a history of using its comparative advantage in minerals as a geopolitical tool or weapon against Japan, against South Korea, and now directly against the United States. And there's long been not so veiled threats in that space too. So this is clearly a risk. And I think, one of the downside risks for China is that, I think Morgan's really been lifting up the market effects here. When you start saying we're going to restrict exports of a material, the market reacts, both in terms of, what happens is prices go up. And then all of a sudden it becomes more economic to produce these things elsewhere. And so a lot of times the market will correct. The problem is I see a couple of different problems with that. One is that, in all of the 70-year history of oil and gas markets, oil markets going through turbulence, there's never been a true supply shortfall. It's just been a question of rearranging and correcting and reacting to prices. But man, the damage that's been done to the global economy during those corrections has been severe. We've seen recessions more than once where oil prices have played a direct part. So even if there's no real supply disruption and things can correct, what happens in that interim while the correction is going on can be seriously damaging. And, again, that's where conflicts happen, where things can really go wrong. So I'm always really leery of being like, oh, the market will take care of it, because, a lot of bad things can happen along the way to a market correction. And then there are some materials where certain producers just have a really strong advantage. So that's true for cobalt, where the Democratic Republic of the Congo has most of the world's supply. It's true for Brazil, where they have most of the world's niobium. It's true for China, where they have very strong advantage on rare earth elements. So in other words, the ability of the market to correct is more limited in those materials. And then also you're talking about some economies like the United States that have mixed market economy that are waiting for the market to do its job, competing with countries that use state-owned enterprises and national investments where they don't necessarily have to be making money in order for an investment to be made or maintained over the long term. And that creates some real competitive dissonance that where that leads over the long term is a really good question. Then the other condition that I think really concerns me is that, the trends aren't great right now as far as the global environment goes, both in terms of the consequences of industrialization with climate change and biodiversity loss, and then the increases in demand as more communities around the world get a higher standard of living, which they are entitled to, the sufficiency of those resources. I worry that we're heading into a time of absolute scarcity, or at least the ability to, to access materials in a fair, equitable, and consistent way, given all the turbulence that's going to come with these changes. And again, that's different from saying, oh, there's enough of this, the market just needs to rearrange and correct. There are some trends in there that are really troubling. So there's good news, bad news, in that if the Chinese really restrict exports, particularly something that they don't really control the full market, then the prices go up so much that their ability to lock that market in from somebody else, I think, comes under question. But, at the same time, if they've made a government to government agreement that's restrictive, is that going to hold? Or is when that agreement includes a price that's well below the global market price, will it break? Who knows? It's a good question.
One question for you, Morgan. I'll try to get in a couple more questions. If the U.S. is to develop mineral resources at home and with foreign partners, how much reliance will the U.S. have on international scientists and engineers to make that a reality? So I think it'd just be interesting just to hear a little bit more from you, where you sit at one of the world's top schools for this. What are you seeing in terms of trends, and who has the brain power to make this happen?
Well, just going back to this this China trade war, for lack of a better term, I do think it is a trade war, and we're in. I agree with Sharon. We have the possibility of really having a downward spiral. We wrote something about with the RAND organization about tit for tat with China, between the United States and China, and how, while the press in the United States covered rather hyperbolically this gallium and germanium export control, which at least on paper was not very aggressive and didn't really say very much, as if it was done for no reason other than to hurt the United States. Of course, the United States has put rather, extremely tough export controls especially through the Department of Commerce on semiconductor chips, advanced chips. That sort of trade war, that piece of it, which is probably the most angst-ridden aspect of it, has almost nothing to do with energy or climate change or biodiversity or any of those things. It has to do with the ability of militaries to access cloud computing for AI for warfare. And so when you think about policy, you really have to think about priority, and you just have to look at what's actually not being said, but what's being done to find the priorities. And the priorities right now related to these spaces is actually much more on defense and national security than it is on energy transitions. That's always been the case. It'll probably remain the case. But as far as China, so we talked a little bit about how China dominates the area, especially in the processing of the chemicals, but also in some of the mineral production, and Sharon's mentioned rare earths, and we could talk about other ones. They, of course, also have made massive investments all over the world, and not just through the Belt and Road Initiative. So this was happening prior to Belt and Road. and even in the statistics, if you look at some of the statistics of who dominates the space, where are the real big investments, and you don't see China showing up as much on, say, cobalt because you see the DRC, Congo, show up in the statistics. Of course, many or most of the primary companies in the DRC were, and to a large extent are, owned or managed by Chinese companies or Chinese investments. And so, and they are actively pursuing those essentially diplomatic relationships through investment. And we are, that is, the United States, are not even close to the amount of investment that they have put into these areas. And so, as far as the workforce and the expertise, well, I'm of the opinion that we need as much exchange of ideas and immigration of technical experts as possible, not just in this space, but throughout the economy. And limiting that limits our intellectual prowess, but not everyone obviously agrees with that. China is the country that, at least in the mining space and the processing space, totally dominates the educational front. So they have something like, my colleagues would be able to tell you, but on the order of 70 to 80 programs or universities with programs. Chile has on the order of 6 or 7, and then everywhere else has almost none. So there is certainly a dearth in the training aspect, and that's the future, of course. And so where you see the programs is where you'll see the expertise. So if you want to do minerals refining right now, yes, you're going to have to largely rely on Chinese or possibly Chilean experts as opposed to American ones.
Thank you. Just in the few minutes remaining, I wanted to get in one question because the DRC has come up a couple of times, and also in relation to China being one of the biggest investors there. So Sharon, just turning to you, the questioner asks that they've read about the mining of cobalt in DRC using child labor, and they're wondering about the health and safety of workers where the U.S. gets its material. Is there a U.S. stand on this, and are there any follow-up policies? And just sort of your thoughts on that in general. We've talked about the environmental byproducts, but are there other byproducts that we're not looking at that we should be?
That is definitely part of U.S. policy to look at the child labor questions, to take them seriously. And I would say, by the way, that's a governmental policy, but also U.S. companies. And I think one of the goals there is not just to say we won't do business with you, because especially there's a concept here called artisanal mining, which just means small scale mines. I know artisanal sounds like it's the latte of mining, but that's not really what it means. It just means very small scale. And a lot of mining in places like DRC is at that small scale level. The problem is that if you just say you have bad practices, we're done with you, you have two problems. One is you've just cut yourself out of the world's cobalt supply, but also, this country deserves the right to develop this resource, and it's a major source of income at a national level, but also for the communities, including for these small mines. So the question is, how can you engage to improve the conditions and to stop the use of child labor in these mines, not just how you can be holier and walk away from these producers. So like there's a wonderful NGO called PACT that's really engaged at the community level with how you help improve the conditions and make sure that you don't have bad practices like child labor that we just don't, we shouldn't be supporting. And I think also the same goes for companies. It's really important for companies to adhere to standards, and there's a variety of ways they can do that, including things like IRMA, which is, I'm always going to forget what the acronym stands for, but it's this really great voluntary standards organization that helps monitor things like this so that companies can be sure that in, meeting their bottom line, they're not inflicting harm and damage everywhere they go. So so no, I think as I said in the outset, it's really important for the United States to be clear and with our partners and allies that we're not going to do this at any cost. We're going to do this right. And that's why we should be a trusted partner. We should be a trusted entity at home and around the world for how we're going to do this. And that includes child labor standards. And again, I don't believe for a second that the Congolese want less for their children than we do. So we should be able to partner with them on this.
On that note, it is 1 o'clock. Thank you both. You are just such a wealth of information. And thank you to everyone who asked questions, because there were some really great questions that we couldn't get to in the chat, and I apologize. Our next briefing is on the 16th, October 16th at noon, and we'll be talking about farewell to arms control with the former Deputy Secretary General at NATO. So we're very excited about that discussion. And please, we are a nonprofit. One of the best ways to support us is through membership. We're also having a gala at the end of November, so please buy tickets. This allows us to keep these programs free and open to people around the world, and we have people joining from over 100 countries. So any support you can give is very appreciated. So with that, Sharon, Morgan, thank you so much. Thank you, Brian, for making everything happen behind the scenes, and have a wonderful day, everybody.